And once he was vested, then the other clergy, the priests, I should say, the deacons were probably already vested, would then go off into their little areas off on the side and get vested themselves. Because the priest did not, although the priest vested publicly, it was not in the same way. And if you listen to the prayers that are said as the bishop is vested in the church, they are different and distinct from the presbyter's prayers of vesting. And they're all tied to Christ. And he starts in the middle of the church. His throne is in the middle of the church. Ideally, originally, the pulpit was in the middle of the church with the bishop, because the bishop was the primary teacher. And the high place, or as you would say, is the bishop's throne. It's not the altar. The high chair are the two thrones that the bishop has. One for him to preach in the middle of the church if he wants to do that, or if he's preaching during the liturgy of the word, and the other set up behind the altar and much higher so he could see over the top of the screen and the curtain, in order to preach if he's preaching at the end of the service. And he preached seated, because he was the ultimate, and is the ultimate teacher of the church. And so he preached seated, and everyone else stood. So he's vested in the midst of his people, and in the vesting prayers, as you listen to, he becomes Christ in the midst of his people. You know, Bishop John loves to do this, and thank God he does, so that we can see it more often, even though it does take a lot more work. Okay? You know, because especially getting that homophore on. He stands in the middle of the church, and he becomes Christ in the middle of the church. And this is very ancient, although now he has a different set of clothing than the original set. He has the emperor's clothes. But he becomes Christ in the middle of the church. And he's surrounded by his presbyters, who act at his discretion. So when the bishop is, if you watch the liturgy being celebrated, a hierarchical liturgy, and the bishop is the principal celebrant, the priests do not just go and do their own thing, do they? No. Bishop wants one of the priests to take a doxology, he points to him. Do it. And if the priest is paying attention, which he should be, he doesn't. If he hasn't fallen asleep and he's standing there wide-eyed, I've had this happen, so I'm talking about myself. They're going to be a couple of them. Oh, okay, you're older than me. The deacons also, actually interesting, the deacons tell us what to do, liturgically. But they do that because they're ultimately also the bishop's direction. We serve the bishop and the people both in these very practical and prayerful ways of celebrating this hierarchical liturgy. And guess what? It is biblical. It is biblical. You can see it in the book of Revelation, chapter 4. So I'm going to leave that for you guys to go read at home. Okay? But read it, and then close your eyes, and try to remember the last time you read a hierarchical liturgy. And if you have a good imagination, doesn't have to be real vivid, if you have a good imagination, you will see that taking place. And one of the things in scripture scholarship that is always a constant cause of discussion is the liturgy a reflection of that writing and that vision, or is the vision the reflection of the liturgy that John, the writer of the book of Revelation, was already experiencing? We can't say one or the other. Both are possible. But it shows what the church is like here on earth is directly connected to heaven. So, again, We cannot, as the people of God, celebrate the Eucharist all by ourselves. Neither the priest nor the people. And the priest can only celebrate the Eucharist if he has the permission of the bishop. That's right. He has to have the permission of the bishop. Even the bishop cannot fully celebrate the Eucharist without the people of God. So that's why even in a hierarchical liturgy, even though once the bishop has entered into the altar, and what does he do just before the anaphora, or Eucharistic prayer, begins? After he gives the blessing, what does he say? Let us lift up our hearts. And we respond, we have them lifted up to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is right and just. What is he doing? Asking permission. Let us lift up our hearts. Okay? That's, it is the one direction when you have a deacon celebrating the liturgy, it is the one direction that the presbyter or the priest gives, is in that conversation. Let us lift up our hearts. We have them lifted up to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord. It is right and just. Let us celebrate the Eucharist. Let us lift up our hearts. Let us celebrate the Eucharist. That's what Thanksgiving is. Let us give thanks to the Lord. So, this true synergy, this true cooperation is essential for the church. And it is through the Eucharist, in this communal and corporate experience, that the church is able to become truly present in the world. Everything that we do as the church comes to the Eucharist and flows from the Eucharist. That's a very ancient understanding of the church, reflected in the Second Vatican Council, by the way. But it is that basic understanding. And so this basic church, the bishop, presbyters, deacons, and clergy and people, all together, are the Catholic Church. Get that? Okay? The Church of Parma is the Catholic Church. If every other church ceases to exist, and there is one town with one Catholic church, that is the Catholic Church. And the gates of hell have not prevailed against it. Now, the next step in our understanding of church. It's a little warm in here. What's the next step then? Our bishop. Does our bishop just wander around all by himself? No. Our bishop is in communion with the other bishops of our metropolia. Bishop Gerard, God bless you, of Phoenix. Whoever will become the bishop of Passaic, New Jersey. But since the see is vacant, the administrator serves in that position. And all of them together in communion with Metropolitan William. And that becomes the Pittsburgh Byzantine Catholic Metropolitan Church. The Latin word they use is sui juris. I prefer the word autonomous, but that's okay. Sui juris works as well. But that again is the church. And our metropolitan is in communion with the Pope of Rome. Now we are in a unique position here in the United States because we are the only such church, not only in the United States, but in the entire Western Hemisphere. Because we're the only self-governing church headquartered outside of Europe and the Middle East and India. And so our metropolitan is directly connected and directly in communion with the Pope of Rome. And it's a direct connection. Okay? Now, kind of muddled today because we don't think of it in the way we should be. But a sign of that, although again a muddled sign I have to admit, when our metropolitan went to Rome, all the other Roman Catholic metropolitans, who are not heads of self-governing churches, by the way, received a pallium from the Pope, which looks like a teeny tiny homophorion, which is exactly what it is. Our metropolitan, though, received an homophorion from the Holy Father. His own homophorion, I might add, that was whisked out of his room the night before.
Yeah.
But his homophorion, not a pallium. Now, really, simply a letter of communion between the two would have been sufficient. Theologically speaking, Metropolitan William writing a letter of communion to Benedict, Bishop of Rome, Patriarch of the West, Metropolitan of the Roman province, and Pope. That would have been sufficient. But going and getting the homophorion probably makes us feel a little bit more attached. The interesting thing is that the other patriarchs within the Catholic Church do not receive this from the Holy Father. When Patriarch, or in the Latin understanding, Major Archbishop Stanislav Shevchuk of the Church of Kiev, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, he didn't go to Rome and receive his own homophorion back. He did write a letter of communion to Rome, and they sent a letter of communion back. In the case of the patriarchs, such as I mentioned earlier, Gregory III Laham, when he's elected patriarch and enthroned, then he sends a letter to Rome and says, requesting ecclesiastical communion between the two churches. So it is not this top-down kind of pyramid scheme that is oftentimes the Western understanding of church. Yes, Jerry?
I don't understand what they're giving. I don't understand the word you're using. Can you explain to me?
The letter of communion?
Well, I understand the letter, but you use a different word.
The homophorion, okay.
Yes, what is that?
Okay, the homophorion is that big piece of cloth that the bishop wears on his shoulders. Okay? Now, in our church, there are two different forms of homophorion that are different simply because of convenience. The large homophorion is a piece of cloth about this wide and 10 to 15 feet long, properly speaking, that is attached using a bunch of buttons to our bishop, which is his sign of office. It says he is the shepherd, the father of his people. Okay? And it is symbolic of the good shepherd. And so it's the big thing that you see that sits on his shoulder that looks like it has a cloth going down the front and going down in the back. Okay? Now our bishop usually wears a proper, real homophorion, which is why the deacon and myself and others who have to put it together know how hard it can be. The short homophorion, which is simply for convenience sake, is a large version of a stole. Okay? Sits on the shoulders once again, and it's very big and it comes down the front. The reason for the short homophorion, like I said, is simply convenience. In the Hierarchical Divine Liturgy books from Rome for our church, our bishop has the option to change from the large homophorion to the short homophorion in the celebration of the Eucharist, and then go back to the large homophorion. But typically, our bishop wears either one or the other.